Late autumn wind cut through Ironwood, Montana. Beneath Ironwood Bridge, a GermanShepherd mother lay curled around 5 shivering puppies, bleeding but unbroken. She was never meant to be found. But a night patrol of U.S. Marines rolled past, and one man heard a sound no one else did. A mother's last plea. No one expected them to stop. No one believed what they would uncover. That cry would pull a town into the light, expose a hidden kennel, and turn loss into purpose. What happens next will make you cry and believe in second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. And if you believe no person or animal should be left in the cold, hit subscribe. This story might restore your faith in miracles. The autumn night had settled heavy over Ironwood, Montana, a small mountain town tucked between jagged ridges and vast pine forests. The season's chill crept through every hollow and ravine, and the Ironwood River rolled cold and restless under its aging bridge. A north wind carried the smell of wet leaves and iron from the steel girders sweeping across the empty highway, where a small convoy of marine vehicles crawled along in their evening patrol. Among them sat Gunnery Sergeant Daniel Cole, a man of 36, whose life and posture seemed carved from years of service. Tall and broad-shouldered, with a lean, weathered build, he bore the quiet resilience of someone who had walked through fire more than once. His dark brown hair was cut short, showing threads of gray at the temples, and his steel blue eyes held the calm of a soldier, but also the shadow of grief. Daniel had lost his canine partner Rex during a mission in Afghanistan 2 years earlier, a loss that hollowed him in ways no battlefield wound ever could. Though outwardly composed, the emptiness Rex left never released its grip. In moments of quiet, memories clawed their way back with unrelenting sharpness. The loyalty in Rex's amber eyes, the last desperate bark, the silence that followed. Daniel had buried his grief beneath duty, but the ghost of that dog lingered in every corner of his being. Beasoned him in the rear seat of the Humvee. Set Private Mason Gray 21. And fresh from training, his uniform still stiff with the newness of a recruit's first months. Mason was slender, with boyish features, sandy brown hair that never seemed to stay tucked beneath his cap, and eyes too soft for war eyes that still carried the restless eagerness of someone trying to prove himself. Unlike Daniel's silence, Mason filled the cold rides with talk stories of his hometown in Oregon, of fishing trips with his father, of dreams that sounded naive against the hum of diesel engines. Yet tonight even Mason seemed subdued, his gaze drawn to the black outlines of the forest pressing close to the road. The Humvee's tires hummed across the asphalt, the bridge looming ahead like a shadowed ribcage of iron and stone. Daniel's hands rested on the wheel, steady, his mind drifting against his will toward the echo of Rex's bark. He exhaled slowly, trying to bury it when it came, a sound faint, ragged, almost lost beneath the growl of the engine, a whimper. Daniel's head tilted, instinct pulling taut like a wire. Years of working with Rex had honed his senses to every unusual noise, every tremor in the silence of night. He cut the engine abruptly, and the Humvee rolled to a stop on the shoulder. Mason blinked, startled. "Sir, quiet." Daniel murmured, his tone sharp but low. He opened the door, letting in a gust of icy wind. The night stretched around them still, but for the whisper of pines and the rush of water below. Then it came again, a thin, broken cry, desperate but alive. Mason froze, the sound seeping into him. Is that Daniel didn't answer? Flashlight in hand, he climbed down the embankment, boots crunching on gravel and frost. Mason followed, heart pounding, his breath quickening, and white puffs. The whimper grew clearer, more insistent, guiding them beneath the bridge where darkness pulled thick. Daniel's beam cut through the shadows, and there they were. A German Shepherd mother, her coat matted with dirt and streaked with blood, lay curled on the cold concrete. Her body curved protectively around 5 tiny puppies, barely weeks old, their fur thin and patchy, their bellies pressed close to the warmth she could still offer. The mother's amber eyes lifted to meet the glare of the flashlight. They were not wild with fear nor sharp with aggression, only filled with a desperate plea, a silent cry for help, stronger than her broken body. Her sides heaved with effort, and Daniel could see a limp in her hind leg, crusted wounds along her flank, and ribs that jutted through her thin coat. Mason's throat tightened as he stumbled forward a step. He had never seen anything like it. The sight struck him harder than he expected. His chest clenched as though the night itself pressed down on him. He looked at Daniel, but the gunnery sergeant was silent. His jaw tight, his eyes locked on the dog, as if staring through time. In the amber depths of the shepherd's gaze, Daniel saw Rex, the same unwavering devotion, the same stubborn loyalty. The way Rex had once shielded him from shrapnel, the way this mother now shielded her fragile brood. The weight of memory buckled his heart. He could almost hear Rex barking in that last chaotic moment overseas, see the blur of his body lunging forward, sacrificing everything. Daniel's breath caught grief rushing up to choke him. Mason whispered, "My God," his voice cracked. The young private sank to a knee, overcome by a compassion so sudden and fierce that words seemed useless. His eyes glistened in the dim light. Daniel crouched slowly, careful not to alarm the mother. He softened his voice, that calm tone he once used with Rex during tense patrols. "Easy, girl, we're here to help." The shepherd did not snarl or bare her teeth. Instead, she seemed to sag with exhaustion, her muscles trembling as if surrendering to the faint promise of safety. The puppies whimpered, wriggling closer to their mother's belly. One, the smallest, squeaked weakly, its body shivering violently. Daniel felt the ache tighten in his chest again. He had seen wounded Marines cling to life with less determination. Sir Mason whispered, his voice trembling, "We can't just leave them here." Daniel shot him a look that carried both authority and unspoken agreement. He shrugged out of his heavy marine jacket, the fabric stiff with the scent of diesel and cold sweat, and carefully draped it over the shepherd and her litter. The mother's eyes followed his every motion, but she did not resist. She only laid her head back down, her breath ragged but calmer, her body still curved in that eternal posture of a mother's shield. Mason fumbled with his own gear, pulling free another layer to tuck around the edge of the makeshift shelter. His hands shook not from cold, but from the weight of emotion he had never expected to feel in uniform. He swallowed hard, unable to find words, and for once, silence hung heavy between him and Daniel. Above them, the bridge groaned in the wind, iron joints creaking like an old beast. The river thundered unseen in the darkness, but beneath that bridge, under the harsh breath of autumn, a fragile family clung to life, and 2 Marines stood witness. Daniel's eyes lingered on the shepherd, on her pups, on the silent echo of Rex and her amber gaze. He did not know yet what this moment meant, but deep within, something shifted. He felt the first stirrings of a vow forming in the marrow of his bones. The convoy crept back toward the Marine barracks on the edge of Ironwood, under a sky swollen with clouds, headlights carving yellow beams across the empty highway. The river's roar faded behind them, but in the back of the Humvee, another sound had taken its place. The faint whimper of puppies pressed against their exhausted mother. Wrapped in marine jackets, the bundle lay across Mason Gray's lap, his arms stiff, yet protective. As if the fragile family were more valuable than any cargo he had ever carried. His eyes, usually restless with youthful chatter, remained locked on the tiny movements beneath the cloth. The barracks loomed ahead, a low sprawl of utilitarian buildings built from concrete and discipline, with perimeter lights cutting harsh cones through the night. It was not a place accustomed to warmth or gentleness. Marines marched, worked, ate, and slept in cycles of rigid order. But as Daniel Cole parked the Humvee and cut the engine, a new kind of silence seemed to follow them inside the gates, one broken only by the whimper of lives too small to fight for themselves. Waiting near the medical wing was Dr. Rachel Keener, the unit's military veterinarian. At 32, Rachel was tall and wiry, with long black hair tied back into a neat braid and sharp brown eyes behind rectangular glasses. Her posture was efficient, every gesture trimmed of excess, yet she carried an undercurrent of empathy that surfaced whenever animals were involved. Years earlier, she had grown up on a farm in Kansas, where livestock were treated as expendable tools. Seeing her father put down animals without hesitation had etched a quiet rebellion into her heart. She chose veterinary medicine not for profit, but to fight back against the belief that creatures were disposable. In uniform, she wore her duty with stoic professionalism, but when her eyes fell on suffering, the softness broke through. Daniel stepped out, boots grinding the gravel. He gestured to Mason, who carefully lifted the bundle. As the young private approached, Rachel's expression shifted from clinical readiness to alarm. "What have you brought me?" she asked, voice steady but edged with concern. Mason lowered the jackets, and the mother German Shepherd blinked weakly up at the sudden light. Her ribs stark against her thin coat, the pups stirring feebly at her side. Rachel crouched instantly, her long fingers brushing the dog's flank with practiced care. "She's dehydrated, malnourished." These wounds, she traced the scars and the fresh gash across the hind leg. Her brow furrowed. "These aren't from a fall or accident. They're patterned like she's been caged or restrained repeatedly." Mason swallowed hard. "So she's been hurt on purpose." Rachel's eyes lifted, their sharpness cutting through the night. "Not just hurt, used." She pressed her stethoscope gently against the mother's chest, listening. "She's been bred too often. That's what her body tells me. Whoever had her didn't care if she lived or died, so long as she produced." The words hung heavy in the air. Daniel felt his throat tighten. Memories of Rex clawed again at him. Loyal service rewarded with sacrifice. And here another shepherd ground down by cruelty. His jaw clenched, anger and sorrow twisting together. "Can you save her?" Mason asked, his voice low, almost pleading. Rachel nodded once. "We'll try, but she's weak. The pups, too. They need warmth, hydration, and round-the-clock care." She straightened, brushing back a stray lock of hair, the professional mask sliding back into place. "Bring them in." Inside the sterile white of the veterinary wing, the transformation began. Rachel prepared eye fluids and antibiotics, her movements swift and precise. She assigned Mason the task of warming blankets in the supply dryer, and Daniel gently held the shepherd still while Rachel disinfected her wounds. The dog trembled, but did not fight, as though she sensed this was not another hand of harm, but of mercy. As the night deepened, other Marines drifted in, drawn by whispers of what Daniel and Mason had found. They came curious, some skeptical, a few scoffing that warfighters had no business nursing strays. Yet even those who muttered stood silently as the sight of the fragile animals gnawed at their composure. These were men hardened by drills and deployments, faces cut with discipline, but confronted with 5 blind, mewling pups. They found themselves shifting awkwardly, unsure where to rest their eyes. It was Daniel who broke the silence. His voice, normally firm with command, softened as he spoke. "She deserves a name." Mason looked at him surprised, lighting his young features. Sir Daniel glanced down at the shepherd, her head resting weakly against his arm. "Faith," he said at last. She held on under that bridge with nothing left still protecting them. "That's Faith." The word hung in the sterile air, simple yet resonant. Mason's lips curved into a faint smile. He looked to the smallest pup, the one that had trembled hardest in his arms. Then this little guy should be valor, courage, even when he's barely strong enough to breathe. Rachel looked up from her work, her stern face softened by a flicker of approval. "Faith and valor," she murmured, almost to herself. Fitting. Through the hours that followed, the barracks transformed. Marines rotated through in shifts, heating bottles of milk substitute feeding pups, with awkward tenderness carrying them like fragile cargo from one blanket to another. Jokes were cracked, then died into silence. Then rose again with nervous laughter, as if to disguise the growing sense of investment none of them had expected. Hardened men spoke in hushed voices, murmuring encouragement to creatures too young to hear. Stories were traded about families waiting back home, about childhood pets, about moments of kindness remembered from long ago. One Marine Corporal Jenkins, a broad-shouldered veteran with a scar down his cheek, confessed quietly to Mason that he once had a German Shepherd as a boy, a dog named Duke, that had followed him everywhere until a storm one winter swept Duke away. The loss had hardened him, made him scoff at sentimentality, but seeing Faith stirred embers he thought had gone cold. Another Sergeant Mills, who rarely spoke of anything personal, told Daniel that his sister ran an animal shelter in Colorado, and for the first time his tone carried something almost like pride. Faith lay amidst it all, her eyes half closed, her breath still shallow but steadier now under Rachel's care. The pups slept between feedings, bellies rounder than when they had arrived, tiny paws twitching in dreams only puppies could have. The barracks, usually a place of hard edges, and drill sergeant echoes hummed with a fragile warmth that night. Daniel sat apart for a time, watching silently. His heart, long armored, felt cracks spreading through the steel. He thought of Rex, not with the stabbing pain of loss, but with the fragile tenderness of memory beginning to heal. The presence of Faith, battered but unbroken, stirred something he had not felt in years. The belief that even after ruin, there could still be renewal. By dawn, when the first pale light seeped through the barracks windows, Faith and her pups were stable enough to rest. Marines drifted away to their bunks, but the echoes of their laughter and murmured stories lingered in the sterile halls. For one night, the harsh rhythms of military life had softened, reshaped by the fragile lives of a dog and her 5 pups. Daniel rose stiffly, stretching the ache from his shoulders, and looked once more at Faith. She met his eyes amber to steel blue, and in that moment he understood something he could not yet put into words, that she had given them more than they had given her. Morning light slipped through the narrow windows of the veterinary wing painting, pale stripes across metal tables, and the improvised bedding where Faith and her pups lay resting. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic mixed with the earthier scent of dog fur. Marines shuffled in and out, some dropping by to check on the puppies before their drills, others lingering longer than duty required. The atmosphere, softened by the previous night's care, was already returning to the strict rhythm of the base. Dr. Rachel Keener had been up most of the night, moving with quiet efficiency between IV bags and feeding bottles. Her braid had loosened strands of dark hair falling against the face sharpened by fatigue, but her eyes still carried the sharp alertness of someone trained to spot danger in the smallest signs. When Daniel Cole entered carrying a tray of coffee cups, Rachel glanced up briefly, acknowledging him with the faintest nod before returning to her examination of Faith's hind leg. Daniel set a cup near her elbow. "You've been at it all night." "I've had worse," Rachel replied, her voice low, professional. She lifted Faith's leg carefully, tracing a finger along a line of puckered skin, her brow furrowed. "These aren't just scars, they repeat in the same places: ankles, shoulders, flanks." Mason Gray leaned closer, his young face drawn with curiosity and unease. "Like what caused them?" Rachel's jaw tightened. "Restrains wire, maybe, or narrow cages. See how the fur never grew back cleanly. Someone kept her confined over and over again." She shifted slightly, pressing gently against the ribcage. "And hear the wear on her teeth. Classic sign of gnawing at bars." Daniel's hands curled into fists at his sides. The Marine inside him bristled at cruelty, but the man who had loved Rex felt something deeper, a sorrow that burned into anger. So this wasn't just bad luck someone did this. Rachel nodded grimly. "And not just once, this is systematic. She was used possibly for breeding." The words cut through the sterile air. Mason swallowed hard, his face paling. A kennel, like some underground place. Daniel looked at the pups squirming blindly against their mother's belly, and the thought lodged heavy in his chest. His instincts, sharpened by years of combat, whispered that this wasn't an isolated case. The door creaked open and Lieutenant Marcus Ellison stepped inside. At 35, Marcus carried himself with the lean frame of a man accustomed to long marches and heavier burdens. His uniform fit with practiced precision, every fold sharp, his brown hair neatly trimmed. But it was his eyes, a calm gray blue, softened at the edges, that revealed more than rank. Unlike many officers who wore authority, like armor, Marcus had a gentleness that surfaced in small gestures. The way he paused before speaking, the patience in his gaze. He looked over the scene, the dog. The pups, the Marines, clustered around them and raised an eyebrow. "What's this I hear about a rescue under the bridge?" Daniel straightened instinctively, but Marcus's tone held no reprimand. He walked closer, studying Faith with a quiet intensity. The GermanShepherd stirred, lifting her head, her amber eyes meeting his. Something flickered in Marcus's expression, almost like recognition. "When I was 10, he said softly, my family had a shepherd. Name was Scout. He followed me everywhere, even slept outside my window. We lost him one winter to a hunter's trap. I still remember the sound he made when we found him." His voice faltered, then steadied. "I never forgot. These animals, they don't just serve, they trust." Rachel, surprised by the admission, gave a small nod. Daniel saw Mason's eyes widen, the young Marine unused to such vulnerability from an officer. But not all Marines in the room shared that softness. Corporal Rizzo, a burly man with cropped blonde hair and a perpetually skeptical scowl, leaned against the doorway. Arms crossed. "With respect, sir," he drawled. "We're soldiers, not dog-sitters. We've got drills, patrols, real missions. And now we're wasting hours warming bottles." A murmur of agreement rippled from a couple of others standing behind him. Private Larkin, lanky with restless eyes, added, "It's not regulation. This isn't what we're trained for." Mason bristled, stepping forward. "So what? We just leave them to die." His youthful voice cracked raw with conviction. "That's not who we are," Rizzo snorted. "We're Marines. Compassion doesn't win battles." Before Daniel could respond, Marcus's voice cut in calm, but edged with authority. "Discipline wins battles, but so does knowing what you're fighting for." He let the word settle his gaze, sweeping across the room. "You think caring for the defenseless makes you weak? Look around. Every one of you signed up to protect something bigger than yourself. Sometimes that something is a town. Sometimes it's a child. And tonight it's them." Silence followed. Even Rizzo shifted uncomfortably under the weight of Marcus's gaze, though he muttered nothing further. Daniel exhaled slowly, grateful. He glanced down at Faith, her head now resting lightly against his boot, as though sensing his resolve. He reached a scratch gently behind her ear, and for the first time she closed her eyes in trust. Rachel stood pulling off her gloves. I'll keep monitoring her, but you should know these scars, these patterns, they point to more than random cruelty. If there's one dog like this, there are more. Marcus's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. Then we need to find out where she came from. Mason's voice, though quiet, carried weight. Maybe she can show us. Maybe she can. Daniel met the young Marine's earnest gaze. Doubt shadowed the room, but within it burned the spark of something larger. What began as a rescue under a cold bridge was unraveling into a mystery threaded through Ironwood's shadows, and none of them could yet see where it would lead. The late autumn sun rose reluctantly over Ironwood, Montana, spilling pale gold across the rooftops and frozen streets. The air carried the sharp bite of mountain wind, rattling dry leaves down the gutters and whistling through the skeletal branches lining the town square. Word traveled quickly in a small town, and by morning the story of the Marines rescuing a battered German Shepherd and her litter had spread far beyond the barbed wire fences of the base. Faith and her puppies had unknowingly set Ironwood ablaze not with fire, but with argument. Inside Harper's Diner, the town's central meeting place where the scent of fried bacon lingered like a second wallpaper, residents clustered in tight knots over steaming mugs of coffee. Farmers, shopkeepers, retired, miners, voices rose and fell, some colored with admiration, others edged with frustration. At one booth, Martha Langley, a stout woman with silver-streaked hair tied into a bun and a cardigan peppered with flour dust, spoke animatedly. Martha ran the town's only bakery, her hands always dusted white, her voice full of warmth. "Those Marines saved that poor mother," she said firmly, gesturing with her spoon, "and I'll be damned if I don't bring blankets to keep her warm. What kind of people would we be if we ignored suffering like that?" Across from her, Earl Donnelly, a gaunt rancher with a weather-worn face and a permanent squint from decades under the Montana sun, leaned forward with a scowl. "With all respect, Martha, they're soldiers, not animal control. I pay my taxes so they'll keep us safe, not coddle strays under a bridge." The argument spilled outward voices clashing until the door of the diner opened with a loud creak. In stepped Richard Wheeler, chairman of the town council. Wheeler was a man in his early 60s, tall but soft around the middle, his tailored coat of deliberate contrast against Ironwood's more rugged wardrobes. His thinning blonde-gray hair was always neatly combed, his sharp chin jutted with self-importance, and his cold blue eyes surveyed a room as though every chair and every face owed him allegiance. Wheeler carried himself with the ease of someone used to having the final word. He didn't sit. He didn't need to. His voice carried without effort. "Our Marines are wasting resources," he announced, glancing around at the crowd. "Food, medic, and manpower, all of it meant for defense. Now spent on a dog people. Do you not see the absurdity?" The diner quieted at his booming declaration. Even Earl, though secretly pleased to have support, fell silent, waiting to hear more. Wheeler raised his hand dramatically, his wedding ring glinting. "I've spoken to members of the council. This indulgence sets a dangerous precedent. If soldiers start turning bases into shelters, where does it end? Strays on every cot, puppies in every barracks." His mouth curved into a smirk. "Compassion is fine for civilians, but the military cannot afford distraction." A few heads nodded, though uneasily, but Martha slammed her spoon down so hard the coffee rippled. "You talk about distraction, Wheeler, but what about decency? That dog shielded her babies from the cold while half this town slept cozy in their beds. Those Marines didn't turn away, and that makes them better men than you." The room erupted again, sides chosen as sharply as lines on a battlefield. Wheeler, satisfied he had stirred enough discord, adjusted his coat and left, leaving the cold air of division behind him. Far from the diner's clamor in the quieter corner of town, near the veterinary clinic, Emily Sanders sat cross-legged on her bed, with her laptop glowing in the dim light. Emily was 17, with a wiry frame and restless energy. Her auburn hair usually tied back in a ponytail that frayed by midday. She had freckles scattered across her nose, and eyes the bright green of spring grass eyes that seemed to spark whenever she spoke about animals. Emily had been volunteering at Dr. Keener's clinic for over a year, feeding strays, helping clean kennels, and assisting in basic care. Her parents often teased her for smelling faintly of antiseptic and wet fur, but they admired her heart. She had seen cruelty up close. A litter of kittens abandoned by the railroad tracks the previous winter had scarred her in ways she didn't always talk about, and she carried that memory like armor. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, now typing the name of the page she had just created, Stand with Faith. She uploaded the photo she had snapped that morning. Faith lying curled protectively around her puppies in the marine infirmary. Daniel's jacket draped over her like a blanket. The mother dog's amber eyes, weary yet unbroken, stared into the lens. Emily's caption read, "They call her Faith." She was found under Ironwood Bridge, protecting her babies while injured. Our Marines gave her a second chance. Will you stand with her too? She clicked post and watched the numbers climb almost instantly. First 5 likes, then 10, then a dozen comments. What a brave mama. Where can we donate? Bless those Marines. The page began to hum with energy, drawing support, not just from Ironwood, but from neighboring towns whose residents stumbled upon her post. Later that day, Emily bicycled to the base's outer checkpoint, carrying 2 small blankets she had sewn from scraps. Her hands trembled as she asked the guard if she could deliver them. After a moment's hesitation, the Marine radioed in and she was escorted to the veterinary wing. Daniel was there, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, exhaustion drawn in lines across his face, but softened by the quiet satisfaction of seeing Faith drink water. When Emily stepped inside, clutching the folded blankets nervously, he looked up. "You must be Sanders." "Daniel," said his voice, gravely but kind. The vet mentioned a volunteer. Emily nodded, cheeks flushed. I wanted to bring these for Faith, so she's not cold." Rachel, who was tending to the pups, smiled faintly, the stern lines of fatigue easing. "That's thoughtful, Emily. Thank you." Faith lifted her head as Emily approached. The dog sniffed the fabric, then laid her chin down upon it, eyes fluttering shut. Emily's throat tightened. "She's beautiful," she whispered. Daniel studied the teenager's earnest face, the way her eyes shone with a mixture of anger at cruelty and hope for healing. He recognized something in her, the same fire he had once carried when Rex was alive. "You keep that page of yours going," he said finally. "Maybe the town needs to be reminded what loyalty looks like." Emily grinned, her freckles deepening as she smiled. "I will." Outside Ironwood streets churned with whispers and arguments. Council members scheming with Wheeler, while Baker's farmers and students rallied quietly in Faith's defense. The small mountain town had become a stage split by a dog's survival. Inside the base, however, amidst the smell of antiseptic and the soft whimpers of newborn pups, a different kind of battle line was being drawn. One not with weapons, but with compassion. The afternoon sky over Ironwood was a patchwork of pale gray clouds and shafts of weak sunlight cutting through. The chill air carried the scent of pine and distant wood smoke as the Marines prepared to transport Faith for a follow-up examination. The puppies had grown more restless in their crate eyes, still closed, but voices louder, and Faith had begun to regain some strength under Dr. Rachel Keener's steady care. Daniel Cole carried himself with quiet determination as he adjusted the leash gently fastened around Faith's neck. The dog still limped slightly, her ribs faint beneath the fur, but her spirit was sharpening each day. Mason Gray walked beside them, cradling the small crate of squirming pups, his arms tense, as though the fragile lives within might slip away if he loosened his grip even an inch. They rode in the back of a military jeep, the rumble of its engine echoing against the foothills. Rachel sat opposite Daniel, her medical bag at her feet, her eyes flicking constantly to Faith, as though measuring every breath. The streets of Ironwood bustled more than usual. Townsfolk stopped to glance, some with smiles, others with narrowed eyes. The divide in public opinion was growing clearer with each passing day. Daniel noticed Martha Langley, the baker, waving warmly from her storefront, a basket of bread cooling by the window. Across the street, however, Earl Donnelly shook his head, muttering something under his breath to a fellow rancher. It was then, just as they approached the veterinary clinic, that the sound came, a deep growl of a diesel engine, louder and heavier than the jeep. Faith stiffened, her ears pricking. Then suddenly she froze. The truck came into view, its logo painted in bold letters along the side Silver Creek kennels, a long enclosed transport vehicle, its back grated and reinforced. Faith's reaction was immediate. She let out a low, guttural whine, then lunged sideways, trying to pull away, her amber eyes widened, wild with recognition and fear. She barked sharply, the sound raw, desperate. Mason nearly dropped the crate in surprise. What's wrong with her? Rachel's face went pale. She knows that truck. Daniel's instincts kicked in. He steadied Faith, murmuring softly, one hand gripping the leash, while the other stroked her back. Easy, girl, I've got you. But even his calm tone couldn't quell her trembling. He glanced quickly at the side panel of the truck, committing the number and lettering to memory. The driver was a burly man in his 40s, red-faced, with a baseball cap pulled low. His arms were thick, and his posture slouched in the seat, as though the world bored him. He cast only a cursory glance toward the Marines before pulling the truck around the corner, its rumble fading into distance. Faith didn't relax until the sound disappeared entirely, her chest heaving, as if she had run miles. Rachel exchanged a grave look with Daniel. That's no coincidence. Later that evening, Ironwood lay under a blanket of cold mist, the kind that clung to clothes and muffled footsteps. The Marines began their routine patrol. Daniel volunteered for the sector near the industrial edge of town, where warehouses lined the roads like silent sentinels. Mason, eager as ever, joined him. The jeep's headlights cut across gravel as they approached the district. The Silver Creek name came back into Daniel's mind, pulling at his thoughts like a thorn that refused to be ignored. They parked near an old storage lot, its chain-link fence sagging, the padlock rusted but clearly replaced recently. See that Daniel pointed. Fresh tire tracks crisscrossed the dirt deep and wide as though from heavy transport vehicles. The soil was still damp, the grooves sharp. Whoever had driven here had done so recently, within hours. Then came the sound, faint at first, almost smothered by the silence of the night. But once Daniel cut the engine, it grew clearer, muffled, hollow, trapped. The sound of dogs barking, but strangled as though buried behind walls. Mason's throat tightened. They're in there. Daniel's jaw hardened. He raised a hand signaling silence and moved closer to the fence. Through a gap in the boards, his flashlight caught fleeting shapes, stacks of crates, shadows shifting behind barred openings. The barking rose in a sudden chorus before dipping again as though silenced by something unseen. Mason whispered, "This isn't just a kennel. It feels like a prison." Daniel's eyes narrowed. Every fiber of his being screamed to act to storm inside, but training held him back. He took photographs, quietly documenting tire tracks and faint markings on the building, faded letters that matched the Silver Creek logo. Mason shifted beside him, his youthful energy brimming with restless fire. He turned, voiced low but trembling with conviction. "Sergeant, I've done patrols, drills, training exercises, but this feels different. For the first time since I put on this uniform, I feel like I'm fighting for something that matters more than orders." Daniel looked at him, really looked. Mason's face was lit by the faint beam of the flashlight. Young earnest, the freckles on his cheeks stark in the cold air. Eyes burning with both fear and purpose. Daniel remembered being that young once before Afghanistan had carved losses into his soul. He saw in Mason not naivete, but the raw beginning of courage. He placed a hand on the younger man's shoulder. "It matters, Mason. Don't forget that feeling. It'll carry you through darker battles than this." They withdrew quietly, slipping back into the mist, without drawing attention. As they returned to the jeep, the muffled cries of the trapped dogs followed them like ghosts, a chorus that lingered long after the engine started again. Daniel's mind spun with images, faith trembling at the sight of the truck, the tire tracks pressed into damp earth, the dog silenced too quickly inside the warehouse. The trail was forming faint, but undeniable, and he knew it was only the beginning. The night air over Ironwood had turned sharp, the kind of cold that seeped into bones even beneath a Marine's thick jacket. Daniel Cole walked alone past the outer fence of the base, the gravel crunching under his boots. He had been summoned quietly, not through radio or chain of command, but through a folded note slipped beneath his door. The handwriting was shaky, hurried. "Meet me at the old railway shed. Midnight come alone. B.H." The shed sat on the outskirts of town, half collapsed, its tin roof groaning when the wind cut through. A dim lantern flickered inside, throwing long shadows across the dusty floor. There, hunched against a beam, stood a man with the weary posture of someone carrying years heavier than his age. Ben Harlow was in his late 40s, his frame wiry but tired, a faded plaid shirt clinging loosely to his shoulders. His once dark hair had gone prematurely gray at the temples, and his face bore a permanent shadow of stubble, as though grooming had long ceased to matter. His eyes gray, restless, darted toward every creak of the shed, as though the walls themselves might be listening. His hands trembled not entirely from the cold, but from the weight of fear. "You're Cole?" Ben asked, his voice raw a rasp that spoke of cigarettes and sleepless nights. Daniel nodded. "You asked for me. Speak plainly." Why Ben swallowed, pulling a weather-stained folder from under his coat. "Because you found her the shepherd faith. I know where she came from. I know what Silver Creek Kennels really is." Daniel's eyes narrowed, though his face remained calm. "Go on." Ben laid the folder on a crate. Inside were printed logs, rough hand-drawn maps and photographs. Dogs and cages rose their eyes dulled by neglect. His voice trembled as he continued. "I worked there for 2 years. Thought it was just breeding until I saw the truth. The dogs weren't treated like animals. They were inventory. Females locked in pens, bred until their bodies broke. Puppies taken too early, sold under fake papers. If one got sick," his words faltered. "They didn't waste medicine. They just disposed of them." The wind rattled the shed, underscoring his confession. Daniel's jaw clenched. He forced himself to stay steady. "Why come forward now?" Ben rubbed a hand across his lined forehead. Because I couldn't keep it quiet anymore. I tried before, went to the council to Wheeler. You know what happened? Got fired the next day, threatened followed. They said if I opened my mouth again, I'd end up like the dogs. His gaze dropped. But when I heard about the Marines finding Faith, I thought maybe this was my chance to make it right. Daniel studied him for a long moment. He saw not just fear, but desperation. The haunted look of a man who had watched too much suffering and had no one left to confide in. He nodded. You did the right thing. Ben exhaled, shaky. Here. Map of the warehouses, the kennels. Not exact, but close enough. And records some I copied before I ran. It's not everything. They'll have wiped most of it. The folder was thick with smudged ink and hastily drawn lines. But it was proof more than rumors, more than suspicions. Daniel tucked it under his arm, his voice low but firm. This stays between us for now, but I'll use it. Ben gave a small, broken nod, eyes glistening. Just don't let Faith go back there. She deserves better. Back at the base, the veterinary wing had fallen into uneasy silence. The hum of the generator filled the background as Rachel sat at her desk, frowning at her computer screen. Her dark eyes, usually steady with clinical focus, now flashed with alarm. Daniel, she called sharply when he returned. Her tone clipped with urgency. The clinic's database records X-rays everything tied to Faith. It's gone wiped clean as if someone hacked in and erased every trace. Daniel stepped closer, scanning the empty screen. You have backups? Rachel shook her head grimly. Only the local server, and that's what's been cleared. Whoever did this knew what to target. Before Daniel could respond, Corporal James Ortiz, the unit's communications specialist, stepped in. Ortiz was in his early 30s, a compact man with olive skin, close-cropped hair, and perpetually ink-stained fingers from jotting notes. His quick wit often clashed with his serious demeanor when tech was involved. He carried a portable hard drive under one arm, his grin sheepish but triumphant. Lucky for us, Ortiz said, I mirror important files on my own drive. Don't trust military servers as far as I can throw them. I've got Faith's records saved. He set the drive down with a tap. Whoever wanted them gone won't be happy they failed. Rachel let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Daniel gave Ortiz a firm nod. Good work, keep this off network and quiet. Ortiz saluted casually, but his eyes were serious. Already done. That night, long after the clinic lights dimmed and the Marines rotated into guard shifts, Daniel lingered near Faith's pen. She was restless, her amber eyes flicking from shadow to shadow. The puppies slept in a pile of tiny limbs and soft whimpers, except one. Valor the runt stirred fitfully. His breathing hitched shallow and rapid. His small chest rose and fell too quickly, each breath a struggle. Faith reacted before anyone else did. She nudged him urgently with her nose whined low and sharp, then pawed at the bars until Daniel stirred awake from the cot nearby. He rushed over instantly on alert. Rachel, his voice cut through the quiet like a crack of gunfire. Rachel arrived within moments, her braid loose lab coat hastily thrown over night clothes. She knelt, lifting Valor carefully, her brow furrowing as she checked his breathing. Respiratory distress could be fluid in the lungs. She barked orders with crisp precision. Oxygen mask, warm blankets, move, move. Mason, woken by the commotion, stumbled forward, fear etched in his young features. Is he going to make it? Rachel didn't look up, her hand steady even as tension lined her face. If we're fast, yes. Daniel's heart pounded as he held the oxygen tube steady, Rachel guiding Valor's tiny face into the mask. Faith hovered anxiously, whining, her body taut as a bowstring. The room was a storm of movement, or teas fetching supplies. Mason clutching a towel. Rachel murmuring calm assurances as she worked. Minutes stretched like hours, until finally Valor's chest began to steady. His breaths grew deeper, less ragged, his tiny paws twitching against Rachel's hands. A fragile sound, half squeak, half sigh, escaped him. Mason exhaled loudly, relief flooding his face. "He's okay." Rachel gave a small, tired smile, her eyes softening. "He's a fighter just like his mother." Daniel reached down, brushing Faith's head. "You saved him," he whispered, and Faith pressed her muzzle against his hand, as though she understood. The night over Ironwood was moonless clouds swallowing the stars and casting the valley into an uneasy darkness. At the edge of town, convoy headlights cut through the black, their beams bouncing off frost-slick pavement. Marines in full gear rode in silence, their faces' stern breath fogging in the cold. This was no battlefield overseas, yet the tension felt the same. Tonight their mission was not to fight men with guns, but to liberate the voiceless. Sergeant Daniel Cole sat at the front of the lead Humvee. Eyes narrowed as the map Ben Harlow had given him replayed in his mind. Silver Creek Kennel sprawled across a secluded lot on the town's northern edge, disguised as an agricultural facility. Behind chain-link fences and corrugated walls, dogs were suffering. He tightened his grip on the rifle across his lap, though the weapon felt symbolic more than practical. This wasn't about killing, it was about protecting. Beside him, Private Mason Gray adjusted his helmet nervously. Mason, barely 20, had a youthful face that hadn't yet lost its softness, though tonight it was hardened by resolve. He whispered, "Feels strange, sir. We're rolling out like it's a combat op, but for dogs." Daniel glanced at him, his voice steady. "Mason, every mission worth fighting is about more than what it seems. These dogs didn't choose their fight, so we fight for them." At the staging area, local police vehicles waited with flashing lights muted, joined by trucks from the county's animal control unit. The police chief, Harold Decker, a man in his late 50s with a barrel chest and thinning silver hair, greeted Daniel with a curt nod. Decker's craggy face carried years of service, a mixture of weariness and iron discipline. His voice was gravelly, but calm. "Marines secure the perimeter. My men handle arrests. Vets go in as soon as it's safe." Next to him stood Dr. Susan Hale, head of the Regional Veterinary Task Force. She was a tall, willowy woman in her 40s, with sharp cheekbones, auburn hair tied back in a severe knot, and steel-rimmed glasses perched on her nose. Compassion softened her otherwise severe features, a quality earned from years of treating abandoned animals. She held a satchel of medical supplies strapped across her body, her hands already gloved. "Once the doors open, my team goes straight to triage," she said firmly. "Some won't have hours left without care." Daniel nodded, admiration flickering in his expression. "Then let's move." The convoy advanced, Marines spread out, boots pounding dirt, securing fences and blocking exits. Police lights flared alive as bolt cutters snapped chains and gates swung open. The first building loomed ahead, a warehouse with peeling paint and a stench already wafting through the cracks. Daniel and Mason led the entry team. With one kick, the padlocked door gave way, and the smell hit them. A nauseating blend of rot ammonia and despair. Inside, rows of cages stacked like grim filing cabinets lined the walls. German Shepherds, Labradors, even smaller breeds whimpered or barked hoarsely. Some were emaciated ribs jutting under matted fur. Others bore scars, infected wounds, or eyes dulled to lifelessness. The Marines' flashlights swept across the room, illuminating horror after horror. Mason gagged, lifting a hand over his nose. God, he whispered, his voice breaking. Daniel steadied him with a firm hand on his shoulder. Keep moving. They're counting on us. As the cages opened, dogs stumbled out. Some too weak to stand, others bounding forward with desperate energy. Marines knelt, offering water and quiet reassurance. Mason found himself kneeling beside a young shepherd with mangled ears, stroking its trembling head. Easy, boy. You're safe now. His eyes glistened. His usual chatter silenced by raw emotion. Then a sound rose above the chaos. A sharp, frantic bark. Faith, who had been brought along under Rachel's supervision, pulled at her lead, her body quivering with recognition, her amber eyes fixed on a shadowed cage in the far corner. Daniel followed her gaze. Inside crouched a large German shepherd, his coat darker than Faith's, his frame muscular though gaunt from neglect. His ears twitched, his amber eyes brightening the moment they met Faith's. The dog let out a deep, guttural whine pressing against the bars. Faith answered with a bark that cracked into a whimper, her whole body straining toward him. Rachel's voice trembled. She knows him. Daniel unlatched the cage. The shepherd staggered forward, collapsing into Faith's side. The two touched noses' tails, thumping weakly, a reunion raw with recognition. Mason murmured, "Guardian." That's what we should call him. He looks like one. Rachel nodded, smiling faintly, despite the heaviness of the moment. Faith and Guardian. Around them, chaos turned to coordination. Dr. Hale's team moved swiftly, assessing bandaging and tagging dogs onto logs for transport. Police handcuffed kennel workers found hiding in offices. Marines carried out limp bodies that still breathed, laying them on blankets where volunteers rushed forward, and outside, the world was watching. Emily Sanders, her dark hair pulled back under a wool cap, clutched her phone with steady hands. 17, with the fierce determination of someone who had discovered her purpose, she streamed the entire raid live. Her voice trembled at first, but soon found strength. This is Ironwood tonight. This is Silver Creek Kennels. These dogs were trapped, forgotten, but not anymore. Look at them. Look at what's being done. Within minutes, comments flooded in. Viewers from Ironwood and neighboring towns tuned in, outrage boiling into solidarity. Cars began to arrive at the staging area, ordinary townsfolk bringing blankets, food, and medicine. Some who had once scoffed at the Marines' dog mission now stood shoulder to shoulder, carrying bowls of warm soup for the soldiers and biscuits for the rescued animals. Among the crowd, Richard Wheeler, the council chairman, appeared. His broad frame, once commanding in town meetings, now looked diminished under the glare of police lights and the accusing eyes of neighbors. His booming voice had no effect, as reporters swarmed, questions flying. By morning, the council would vote to suspend him, but in this moment, his authority had already evaporated. As the last cages were emptied, Daniel stood at the doorway, breathing in the cold night air. Around him, dogs whimpered, barked, or curled into the safety of blankets. Faith lay pressed against Guardian. Her puppies nestled at her side under Rachel's watchful eye. Mason crouched nearby, stroking Baller, whispering, as though making a vow. Decker approached his lined face somber. "You did good, Sergeant. We'll get the rest of the paperwork sorted. Tonight you and your men saved more than just animals. You saved this town from turning a blind eye." Daniel nodded quietly, his gaze sweeping over the rescue dogs, the exhausted volunteers, the glow of headlights against the dark sky. For the first time in years, he felt something stir where grief had long welled. Hope. The town of Ironwood woke that morning to a sky brushed with the faint rose of early summer. The mountains stood clear, their snowcaps retreating, and the air held a rare stillness, as though nature itself waited. A year had passed since the raid on Silver Creek Kennels, and the town was no longer the same. At the gates of the Ironwood Marine Base, banners fluttered in the breeze, painted with words that once would have seemed unlikely. Faith and Valor Day. Inside the base, Marines in pressed uniforms worked alongside townsfolk, arranging rows of chairs, stringing up lights, and setting a makeshift stage. Children ran ahead of their parents, eager to see the dogs who had become local legends. The once gray building seemed brighter, softened by garlands of wildflowers and hand-painted signs crafted by school children. Thank you, Faith, and hope lives here. Sergeant Daniel Cole stood at the edge of the parade ground, his posture still military sharp, though his face carried new gentleness. His short dark hair was streaked faintly with gray, his eyes steel blue, but softer than they had been a year ago. The weight he carried from Afghanistan had not vanished, but it no longer crushed him. It had been reshaped into purpose. Beside him sat Faith, her coat now gleaming, her body lean and strong. Her amber eyes watched the growing crowd with calm vigilance, her puppies no longer fragile, bounding nearby. Valor, once the weakest, had grown into a sturdy young shepherd with a deep chest and bright, intelligent gaze. A blue therapy vest was strapped around his frame, his demeanor calm and patient, as children reached tentative hands to stroke his fur. Each child smiled wider, each parent whispered thanks. Valor responded with quiet dignity, embodying the name Daniel had chosen for him. Guardian, larger and darker in coat than Faith, stood close to her side. Though scars marked his muzzle and shoulder, they no longer spoke of despair, but of survival. Where Faith was gentle guardian, was watchful, his head lifting at every sound. A silent protector, whose loyalty radiated in the way he never strayed far from her or the Marines. Private Mason Gray, still impossibly young, though more seasoned now, crouched to ruffle Valor's ears. His once nervous energy had steadied into confidence. He grinned at Daniel. He listens better than half the recruits I trained with. Daniel chuckled, the sound rare, but genuine. That's because Valor knows what's at stake. The program began with music from the high school band, the brass notes wavering but heartfelt. At the podium, the mayor introduced the keynote, Emily Sanders. Emily had grown in the year since she first live-streamed the raid. 17 then, now 18. She carried herself with poise beyond her age. Her long, dark hair flowed over a simple white dress. A blue ribbon pinned at her chest, reading Ironwood's Young Hero. Her voice, once tremulous, rang clear as she spoke. A year ago, this town was divided. Some doubted, some resisted. But one dog's cry under a bridge reminded us what compassion means. Faith and Valor showed us that kindness is not weakness. It's courage. Today, with the Faith and Valor Foundation, we vow that no animal will suffer unseen again. Applause rose, scattered at first, then swelling until it filled the grounds. Daniel found himself clapping his chest tight with something that was not grief, but pride. The Foundation's banner unfurled behind the stage. Its emblem, a silhouette of two German shepherds framed by a rising sun. The Foundation had already funded rescue shelters in 3 neighboring counties, with Marines volunteering shifts when off-duty. Rachel Keener had become its medical director, while Mason Spear headed training programs for young volunteers. Daniel himself sat quietly on the board, preferring to let others speak, though his guidance shaped every decision. The crowd hushed as candles were passed out. Each flame lit from the next until a sea of light shimmered across the base. At the signal, townsfolk, Marines, and children carrying dogs in their arms began walking toward Ironwood Bridge. It was there, beneath those iron beams, and the echo of rushing water, that everything had begun. At the bridge, Faith paused, gazing into the shadows as if remembering. She lowered her head, pressing her muzzle against Valor's, while guardians stood tall beside them. Emily set her candle at the water's edge, followed by dozens more, until the river glittered with reflection. The mayor spoke softly, his words drifting on the night air. "Tonight, we honor not only the dogs saved, but the light they brought to this town." A cry in the dark became a beacon of hope. Daniel stepped forward last, his candle trembling slightly in his hand. He thought of Rex, the canine he had lost years ago overseas, whose memory had haunted him with guilt and silence. Tonight, that wound no longer felt like a weight. It was a scar like Guardian's proof of survival, not of defeat. He placed his candle on the water, watching it float downstream. Faith leaned against his leg, steady and warm, as though affirming that grief could indeed be remade into purpose. Mason stood nearby, murmuring to a cluster of townsfolk who once had opposed them. Now those same people handed him donations for the foundation. Their faces humbled, their voices contrite. Children knelt to pet the rescue dog's laughter, mingling with the crackle of candle flames. For Ironwood, this night was more than remembrance. It was transformation. The ceremony ended with a hush as the candles drifted together in the current, forming a cluster of light, moving steadily into the dark. Daniel lifted his gaze to the sky, no longer empty, but alive with stars breaking through the clouds. The narrator's voice carried in the silence, not spoken, but felt by every heart present. Even in the darkness beneath a bridge, a single cry can ignite unto community. Even the smallest voice can become the light that guides us home. Sometimes the smallest cry in the darkness can move hearts, bring people together, and remind us that miracles are real. Faith and Valor were not just names for two dogs. They were reminders from God Himself that even in our weakness, His light shines strongest. In our everyday lives, we often walk past suffering, but when we choose compassion, we become part of a greater story of hope. Just as this town was changed by the courage to care, may we also carry that spirit into our families, our neighborhoods, and our daily choices. Remember, God can use even the gentlest soul to bring healing where the world has turned cold. If this story touched your heart, please share it so others can find hope. Leave a comment with your thoughts and subscribe for more stories of courage and redemption. And may the Lord bless you and your family with peace and strength. If you believe in His miracles, type Amen in the comments as a prayer for all who still wait for rescue.